Hi, this is my review of Bladestorm, the second edition Rulesbook. This is the most recent edition of a fantasy skirmish game that came out in the 1990s. With this current edition, you can play this as a classic fantasy skirmish game, but by using some of the rules presented in the core system or some of the optional rules, you can also play this as a role-playing game or as a game that is more on the mass battles side of things. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. I have a few criticisms when it comes to the quality. The document is not bookmarked, so it's quite difficult to make your way through this almost 200-page rules book. And the table of contents is not hyperlinked, so it's somewhat difficult if you decide to use this from your computer or your portable device. It's not as easy to navigate. And even though everything is well written and explained, I did find a few errors, not too many of them, just a few. For example, in some combat explanations, I found that some values were confused. It should have been, for example, +4 when it was actually +2 and such. And I think they also mentioned turn when it should have been a phase, at the phase of a turn. But those things are quite minor, so you'll have no trouble at all understanding the content of the rules book, because everything is actually quite excellently explained despite those 2 or 3 errors that I found. There are also a few blurry or low-res images, not too many of them, mostly related to diagrams and some of the character cards or templates or sheets. Maybe because they were taken from the older rulebook, but this is still a minor thing, because when it comes to the diagrams, you get what the picture is expressing when it comes to the rules content. You will have no trouble at understanding the diagrams. And when it comes to the character cards or sheets, you can download them for free, looking quite clear and high res from RPG Now. And I'm going to put the links in the description below so that you can know where you can purchase this game and download the free template sheets and such. But that's the end when it comes to my criticism of the document, because the document is quite beautiful to look at and everything is excellently explained, well organized and written. I also like the graphic design and layout. The illustrations look awesome as well. I found some that were quite breathtaking and expressing that sense of classic fantasy, although a lot of them look a bit more on the high fantasy side of things, or quite modern, but they still communicate that old school flavor. Now let's talk about the contents. First, you have a really nice introduction to what Bladestorm is. Bladestorm can be played with any miniatures that you already have. There is a Bladestorm line of miniatures, if I'm not mistaken, but this is a game that you can play with any miniatures that you have from other role-playing games or board games. And you can, well, you only need 6-sided dice to play this game, although it is handy because at times you need to roll a 10-sided die, so I would recommend that you get your set of typical 7 polyhedral dice. But for the most part, you're going to be rolling 6-sided dice. And when it comes to the bases of the miniatures, it's a lot better if they are based in square bases. But it's no trouble at all if you have a lot of miniatures with circular bases like me. So I mounted my circular based miniatures on these little tiles that I got from Dungeon Tiles and other board games, and it became no trouble at all if you want to organize your units and individual combatants like that. They even give you tips on how to handle the base aspect of things. They tell you how to mount your miniatures or on perhaps cardboard bases or thick cardstock or thin plastic sheets. So that's no obstacle at all. I like it that they use a lot of diagrams to explain basically everything about the game. And they even give you tips on how to play this game if you like to use grids. Although I played using both the grids and the free form style of things, and I liked it a lot better without grids, just using my measuring tape to move my miniatures across the battlefield. I forgot to mention the quality that they also use a lot of pictures of miniatures and scenery, and I like that quite a bit. Many times when I was experiencing Bladestorm, I got that sense of rediscovering what classic fantasy skirmishes were all about, so that's great. This game is excellently taught to you in a form of mini tutorials. First, they show you the game in a very basic or introductory way through a basic game rule set. This basic game rule set explains some very basic, very minor aspects of the game. You could say that this is a way of playing the game that is not suited for long-term play. It's just for you to understand the basic concepts. Later on, as you add more rules and more depth and complexity to the game, you'll start to see what Bladestorm is really all about. But let's talk about the basic game first. In Bladestorm, each turn is divided by phases. The turn sequence is quite clear, and it makes sense in portraying a simultaneous feel of the battle. They give you a example scenario, Warriors of Ash, where you control either a sea troll or a group of 3 goblins. And this is a really fun way of understanding the game. With the turn sequence, you first roll to determine initiative. And after that, the player who decides to go, who goes first, determined by initiative, gets to move all of his miniatures. That's the move phase. And then you go on to the melee attack phase. So that's important. First you move your miniatures, and when they are all set up, they get to perform a melee attack if they are in base contact with an enemy. Attacks are carried out quite in a simple way, but that still allows for a lot of surprises. You basically roll, for example, 3 6-sided dice, and you add the result of that roll with perhaps a bonus. Maybe you have a +2 or +3 to your attack, and if you manage to overcome the defense of your opponent, you score a hit. So maybe your opponent has a defense of 7 and you rolled a 9 or an 8, you scored a hit. The cool thing about the attack roll is that that same attack roll determines damage. For example, let's say that you're attacking with the troll, and your melee damage says high +2. That means that the highest die of the 3 dice that you rolled counts as the damage. So maybe you rolled a 2, a 3, and a 5. That means the 5 is the damage, and because it says high +2, 5 + 2 is 7. So that's the amount of damage that you will deal to your opponent. And if, for example, your damage is low, and maybe you rolled a 2, 3, and 4, that means you deal 2 points of damage. But maybe you rolled more than 1 high or more than 1 low. So maybe, for example, you deal high damage, and you rolled 3, 5, 5. Those 2 5s are going to add up together to 10. So as you can see, the damage is sometimes quite surprising, and the game gets quite gritty at times. So that's really awesome, because this game feels a lot like you are controlling proper role-playing game characters in a skirmish or even mass battle type of situation. And otherwise you would think that to be too cumbersome or tedious or impossible. You could say, oh, but there are so many stats and abilities and powers, how can I have a large skirmish or mass battles type of game with all these detailed characters? But the way the character cards are organized and the way damage and attacks are handled, it's actually quite smooth and quite fast. So that's great. And sometimes even when it comes to damage, it's high plus low. So it's the highest die plus the lowest die, and that's how you deal damage. Now the cool thing of the simultaneous aspect of combat is that when you attack an enemy, that enemy immediately counterattacks. So you cannot be certain that you will, in the case of the goblins, if you attack with a goblin, you have to take into consideration that the troll is going to counterattack immediately. So that troll is also going to roll his 3 dice, and it could score a hit and kill that goblin. So we have to take that into consideration. And so the phases go on like that. The next player carries out his movement and then his melee attacks, and so it goes on. You only remove the defeated when the attacks are carried out. So as I was saying, you cannot be thinking, oh, I'm going to attack this guy first and I will kill that guy before he gets a chance to counterattack. No, you have to take into consideration that you could be eliminated. And so the basic game does this to explain how things are carried out in sequence and with these sample maps that I was saying. But the basic game is, as I was telling you, just an introduction. It has very little when it comes to tactics and strategy, but I still found it quite fun when I was facing my opponent and we suddenly saw, oh, I rolled 3 6s and that's a lot of damage. And so it's quite fun to get surprised by your dice rolls. And then we move on to the intermediate game. In the intermediate game, they add a few more things. And as I was saying, that's an excellent way of explaining the game. Here you have information on terrain types, on new stats, and more information on the turn sequence, on terrain effects, shields, armor, and missile combat and cover. So when it comes to the environment, depending on what you are moving through, your movement will be reduced. So for example, you're crossing a stream or heavy woods, you will have to take that into consideration ahead of things. Because for example, maybe you want to enter a stream. To move through a stream or lake or river, you need at least half of your movement. But that's the half of the entirety of your movement. So for example, if you move 8 inches, you can't be thinking, oh well, I'll just move along and maybe I only have 2 inches left of movement and then I will enter the stream because that only costs half. That is, if I have 2 inches left of movement, I only need 1 inch to move into the stream. But that's not how it works. If you move 8 inches, it's going to take 4 inches to move into that stream. So you have to take that into consideration as you move through the terrain. And this is further somewhat simplified or streamlined by taking only the most cumbersome or significant when it comes to movement reduction in terrain. Perhaps you decide to move through a stream and a forest, and you could be thinking, oh no, that's going to take all of my movement. But no, because the stream reduces your movement more than, say, some medium woods, you will only take the stream movement reduction out of your base movement during that movement sequence. And terrain will add some modifications to your defense. You have a bonus. For example, maybe you are moving through brush, you're going to get a +1 to your defense. Or maybe if you're moving through heavy woods, you're going to get a +3. And if you move in streams, because it's quite difficult to hold your ground in water, it's quite slippery, and you're out in the open, you actually get a -2 to your defense modification, because this is not exactly deep water, it's quite shallow. When it comes to shield bonuses, they add to your defense value, and you have different types of shields for this. And in damage, this is armor reduction. Here, armor mitigates the damage that you suffer. Missile combat is carried out during the movement phase. You get to move 1/4 of your base movement, and you can shoot arrows or crossbow bolts or whatever you are equipped with. And it works quite similar to melee combat. You also have information on partial cover, and in this intermediate version of the game, you can only attack those miniatures that are within 20 inches within your firing range, that is. Then we move on to the standard game, and this is where things get really good. Before that, it still felt too basic of a game, but in the standard game, they just teach you so many things that add so much to the complexity and depth and richness of the experience. And because you have been taught the world so well, the game so well in the introductory intermediate version, it's quite easy for you to learn the rest. So you have many details here. Let's talk about the dice roll when it comes to combat. Here, one of your the dice that you roll is going to be a black dice. And this black dice, if you roll a 1 on it, you score a hit. So there is always a chance for you to score a hit against your opponent. This adds a lot of balance to the game, because some enemies are very well armored and in cover, and they could be almost impossible to hit. But with this black die, you still have a chance to score a hit. Otherwise, the game would become too tedious, too cumbersome. I also forgot to mention that there is a list at the beginning of this document telling you all of the changes and all of the additional rules that have been added since the first edition. So this second edition, based on what I have read and trying to compare with what I know of the first edition, it seems that they improved many things, mostly to speed things up and to add a bit more tactical depth to the game and strategies as well. So you have information on the different combatant cards, everything very clear and well organized. It's quite easy to look at these cards during the game and not get confused on where the combat values are, the weapons and special abilities. And the turn sequence with this version of the game, that is the proper way of playing the standard game, is almost unchanged. You only need to add missile attack and spell attacks to the move phase. There's also the rally phase related to morale, when you have to make checks depending on where you are taking losses and such. And then you carry out the melee attacks and counter attacks that you have already seen in the introductory intermediate version of the game. So you have more information on different terrains. In the intermediate version, they only gave you a few types of terrains, but here you have all the light woods, medium woods, heavy woods, impassable terrain, buildings. And you have all the list of bonus modifiers or penalties that you get to melee defense and missile defense. There's also a terrain morale bonus or negative value. And there's also more details on phasing, because before that you only needed to phase your miniature to counterattack, but they didn't give you any bonuses or penalties depending on whether you were attacked from the flank or the rear. But here it's quite terrible to get attacked from the rear, and from the flank is also not good. And they also give you details on when you are using your shield, because you can use your shield to block try to block attacks from the front or from the side of the armor that is using the shield. That is, if you are using your shield in the left arm, you will be able to block attacks from the front and from the side, the left side in that case. But it also depends on the miniature. Maybe your miniature has the shield on the other arm. So that's a somewhat realistic way of handling things. And then you have information on movement restrictions, because in this game there's also the possibility of moving in units. There are advantages and disadvantages. The basic ones is basically that an individual combatant has an easier time moving through difficult terrain, and it's more difficult to flank or attack that target from the rear. And units, they are more threatening, could get some combat bonuses depending on the situation and the type of formation that they're employing. And they also threaten an area around them, because the individual combatant only threatens an inch around, and the unit threatens 2 inches around itself. So you cannot move near that range unless you are planning to attack that unit. So we have information on those movement restrictions. And when it comes to the terrain, there are also more details on going up a slope, for example, and all of this adds up to the bonuses given by your shield, and how to handle that I was telling you, the flank and rear attacks when, for example, a unit is moving through a specific terrain. I also like it that when you take damage, it's quite difficult to tell if a unit or combatant is going to die right away. Sure, there are some very powerful characters such as trolls or some heroes, but you are never quite certain of if that combatant is going to survive an attack or an assault. You have to be quite mindful of not getting flanked and getting attacked from the rear. So even though you can have a very powerful unit, you're constantly thinking that you need some people to protect his flanks or its flanks or the rear side. You have more details on shooting and the arcs that your base can cover when it comes to front firing attacks and such. More details on morale, because if you take too many losses or perhaps related to some supernatural effects, your unit will have to make some checks related to morale, and you could end up disrupted, or you could end up fleeing the battlefield entirely. And you have all the details on how to make rally checks to avoid that. When it comes to units are streamlined in the way that they fight against other units or even combatants, and they actually have a very powerful impact when it comes to morale. When they are facing just a single combatant, that combatant could get intimidated by the units. So you have information on how to change formation, perhaps move from a battle order formation to general order formation, how to legally organize your units by rows, and how to handle when you are suffering losses, how to place those units of spare in different sites of the unit formation, all of the effects related to movement and losses, how to back up, how to turn your units and wheel around. So units are quite devastating in combat, but not as maneuverable, so you have to keep that into consideration, especially related to the scenario, because there are some scenarios that have a lot of tunnels and caves, and units are going to be quite useless in those places, or maybe there are many ambush points, so moving units can sometimes become an obstacle. And you can have a morale chart explaining everything related to causes, consequences, and results of failed morale rolls. And then we have information on special combatants, because this game also includes information to use leaders, spell users, heroes, and monsters. These are the most powerful units and characters. They can be game changers. Perhaps using units is not very appropriate, because these special combatants do not you cannot make a full unit of special combatants, but they can attach themselves to different units to lead them and augment their melee prowess and such. You even have some bonuses and effects related to the morale that leaders inspire on their troops. So you have information on the leaders that I was saying. You can have multiple leaders, but you have to consider the effects that they're going to bring to the battlefield and to the units around them. You have information on what happens when you lose a leader. You have information on spell users that use different types of magic, that is channeling, essence, and mentalism. And mentalism is actually an exclusive discipline of this second edition. You have information on the spells that they can cast, the levels of power, the power points that they spend, the elemental types of spells that they use, sometimes also determined by the scenario. You roll a six-sided dice in some cases, six-sided die, and you could end up with spells related to fire or wind or electricity and such. And of course, heroes and monsters are the heavy hitters of this game. But what I really liked about Bladestorm is the system of professions. They are kind of like character classes in role-playing games. But you can also develop them as you play scenarios in a campaign. You will become quite powerful. Let's talk about the classes. First, we have the fighter. The fighter feels a bit more on the defensive side of things and quite excellent in melee, of course. But there are many ways to customize him. You have different skill trees that encompass passive and active abilities. So you have, for example, you want to specialize in polearms. You have different ways of advancing through ranks to get a bonus when using polearms. Or maybe you want to specialize in using shields. You get a way to get bonuses to your shield. And different ways of blocking more effectively. And when it comes to active skills, and you can only use this a few times per battle, so you have to wait for the right moment to use them. When it comes to fighter, perhaps you want to use unhorsing. You cause a mounted combatant 2 inches away to separate from his mount. Or maybe you want to perform a great deflection with your shield. Or maybe you want legendary stamina to keep on fighting when all others have already fallen. Well, that is, you are able to take more damage. You also have the assassin, and the assassin is great to take advantage of cover and for disrupting the enemy's formation. You can even make some enemies attack each other by moving through them, and you are also quite skilled with using ranged attacks. And I also like that there are many options to banish from sight when moving through terrain and cover, etc. Then you have the Barbarian, who feels a bit like a wild card or jack of all trades at times. You have some abilities to become quite unstoppable at certain moments. For example, you have the Berserker Rage, that you regain 5 hits each round and make 2 melee attacks instead of 1. But that's really high up the ranks in the skill trees. So you have many ways in which you can customize your Barbarian. And then you have the Rogue, who feels a bit more defensive when compared to the Assassin, that is defensive without resorting to terrain and cover. But the Rogue is also quite useful at going through the defenses of heavily armored opponents. You also have the Warrior Monk, who can use no armor but is quite devastating in his hits. You have things such as Iron Fists and the Nerve Strike, so it's all about debuffing and eliminating your opponent. You also have the Cleric. Then you have a restriction to it that you are not able to use edged or ranged weapons, but you have access to spells, of course. And you are specialized in a bit of healing, but it's a bit more martially inclined when compared to another class that I will cover in a few minutes. Then we have the Druid, who can only wear light armor and no shield, but it feels a bit more flexible when it comes to spell casting when compared to the Cleric. And you have, like, for example, Halo of Thorns, that you deal damage to adjacent enemies, so it feels more offensive when compared to a Cleric. And you have the Magician, that is the archetype of a wizard in a fantasy game, so you're quite devastating using your spells with skills such as Circle of Flame, Chain Lightning, etc. You have the Illusionist, who is more about misdirection and disturbing or disrupting the enemy's attacks and movements. You have the Mentalist. The Mentalist at times feels a bit like a Jedi Knight, and you have like a somersault surprise. Jump behind an adjacent enemy to deliver 3 rear attacks. It reminds me of when Ben Kenobi jumps somersaults over Darth Maul. And then you have the Lay Healer, and this is all about healing. You can only wear light armor or helmet, but you can even surpass the Cleric with healing, and at times you feel a bit like a monk. These are hybrid classes because, for example, you have the Arms Master that can use some Mentalist spells, but is also quite decent in up close and personal. And you have the Ranger. You also have spellcasting abilities, and you are really good at ranged attacks as well. You have the Paladin, excellent at up close and personal, but also with healing potential related to spells. And all of these professions, it can be customized to suit any army formation, because there are ways. For example, maybe you want to play as a Paladin, but your army or your warband is already quite defensive and quite good when it comes to the healing department. Maybe you want to specialize this Paladin to be more offensive. There is actually a skill tree related to two-handed weapons, so you could play as an offensive Paladin if you wanted to. And this applies to all of the professions. You can customize them depending on your needs, on the scenario, on your formation of your warbands or armies. So you have details on how to organize these professions and their skills in different cards, so you can look quickly as you are playing the game, and you don't get lost that, oh well, what's the spell that I'm going to use, or what ability am I capable of employing. I like it that Bladestorm puts great emphasis when it comes to campaigns on how to tie all of the scenarios together, because there are some games sometimes that have this almost like a second thought or an additional thing, but here it's a big part of creating stories through your battles in Bladestorm. When it comes to the spells, all of the different disciplines feel somewhat different. There are some shared spells between the different disciplines, but they'll have their uses. Some are a bit more offensive, so some are more focused on buffing or debuffing different characters and units. So you have lists of spells. When it comes to channeling, you have effects such as cancel magic, repel undead. You even have some evil spells related to each version or discipline. So for example, you have evil spells for the channeling side of things that are kind of like a cramp, to cause a cramp or wounding. You also have necromantic effects. And when it comes to the other paths of magic, you have things such as Storm Call, Animal Form, Lightning Call, Holy Martyr, etc. And these spells, while limited, I also consider them game changers and something that will surprise your enemy as you use different channeling spells, essence spells, mentalism spells. You have some of them are quite classical when it comes to role-playing games and fantasy battle games. You will have your thunderbolts and firebolts and magic bolts and all of that. And then you have a section detailing optional rules. More details on terrain types and how they affect the entire battlefield situation. More ways in which you can modify the turn sequence and add maneuvers, combat maneuvers to cover any other thing that is not related to directly attacking an opponent. Also related to units, maybe you want to run or maybe you want to attempt some acrobatic things. These optional rules will put more emphasis in that. And the level of detail of the optional terrain effects is quite amazing. You get more details on swamp, moving through shallow water or deeper water, moving through slopes and buildings. And do not feel overwhelmed with these optional rules. They are just here if you want to add some spice to different scenarios. It doesn't mean that you have to use all of the optional rules, but maybe for a particular scenario you want to add some of those maneuvers and terrain considerations, because you have information how to carry out charges and disengaging from an opponent and jumping and picking locks, swimming, etc. So this adds a lot. Maybe you want to create a scenario where the characters need to swim across a moat and enter some fortress or castle. You have all the information here to carry out all of that in an efficient way. There's also more information on, for example, how to disband and reform and shift between different formations in a unit and carry out all of the movements that will only, or maneuvers that will only apply to individual combatants. But with these tables and information provided, you can apply anything related to an individual combatant to a unit instead. You also have some options in melee combat, how to carry out parrying and targeting, how to carry out second line polearm attacks, because with the basic rule set, the ones at the back of the formation cannot attack, but if you arm them with polearms, you can attack as well. You have more melee modifiers, more bonuses. You have a fumbles chart with some interesting effects. Maybe the mount dodges an unseen foe, so you could become stunned this turn. Or maybe you are using a polearm, but your weapon hits ground and gets stuck for 2 turns. So this adds a lot more depth to the types of weapons and mounts that you're using in combat, because you also have rules to, of course, ride horses, and even you have rules for flying creatures. Maybe you want to ride some flying mounts, a Pegasus or Griffin. You also have more information on armor advantages and slaying weapons, more fumble charts and roles related to different losses and clumsy attacks, more information on special formations and how you can shift to another formation in the unit to have an easier time moving through difficult ground. You also have songs and war sounds, because maybe you want to include a musician to your unit, and you have different bonuses that work a bit like spells. You also have more details on spells. For example, you want to have spell casting fumbles, and how to carry out special challenges. If you want to challenge someone to a duel, kind of like in those legendary moments in history, like that duel between the Bruce and the Vahur, if I'm not mistaken, that was the name of that knight. You can have some duels, and if you reject that duel, it will take a negative. It will produce a negative effect to your unit's morale or your army's morale. And if you win that duel, of course, you will bolster your unit's morale instead. And then we get to the campaign rules, because this is the coolest thing about Bladestorm. The campaign rules are so well structured that you can even play this as a role-playing game with a game master. Many of the scenarios have these neutral threats or combatants that usually are controlled by players by taking turns, but a game master could control them instead, as he describes the story and adjudicates different rules and situations. To run a campaign, you also follow a campaign sequence. You select a scenario, you set a number of points to build your armies. You may choose to hire mercenaries, you choose spells, you play the scenario, and then you recover the defeated, take into consideration the effects of injury, experience and development. You sell goods and pay mercenaries, and at the end you can buy goods, equip items and recruit forces. The campaign sequence is somewhat involved. In fact, they actually recommend that you take one day to play the battles and another day to organize your forces. So a lot of detail and consideration went into the structure of this campaign. So you have information how to select scenarios, how to set up the battlefield, because some scenarios tell you how to fix or set up different pieces of terrain or tiles, anything related to battlefield. Well, but when it comes to free selection, maybe you just want to play a quick game. You have a method to randomly generate different terrains and features, and they even give you like a diagram how to seat the players around the table, because this game can be played with 2 or even up to 8 players. But I think based on the behavior that they give you of the different neutral forces, that is, they tell you something like, oh, this pack of wolves are guarding this area, they attack anybody entering here, or this other enemy is trying to attack these characters. They give you a bit of an artificial intelligence, not so much and not as structured when compared to other games, but here they give you those guidelines. So I think it's quite possible to play some scenarios or even build your own scenarios where you can play cooperatively or even solo against someone else. It's also important to mention that the older material of Bladestorm that previously released books are compatible with this second edition of Bladestorm, and there is a bestiary that actually includes some random tables, so maybe that could also add to the potential cooperative or solo value of the game. So you have information on how to seat the players on the table surface. It's usually a 3x4 surface, but if you play with, let's say, 8 players, you would need a 3x6 feet surface. And everything is well organized with tables, and there could be permanent injuries when your heroes and special characters get defeated. It doesn't mean that they die or that they flee the battlefield forever. They could actually survive, but with some permanent or temporary afflictions, but there is always a chance of dying, so it's going to be quite harrowing if you have been developing a character of a certain profession and suddenly you die, so you better take care of those characters. You also have details on how to level up, although it's more on the spending experience points type of things. Rather than getting like a set of stats and values, you get some points and you decide what to purchase depending on the skill trees and the attributes that you want to raise. You have an entire campaign consisting of 10 scenarios. You can play them randomly, but you can play them in sequence. They tell the story of some characters arriving at the continent of Fallen, and you can see how your forces grow as you play the campaign. They give you a bit of a glimpse of the continent of Fallen. giving you some of the background. This is a continent surrounded by storms. In fact, this game is called Bladestorm because Bladestorms are these ethereal sites or multitude of sites that cut through different areas in Fallen. And they actually resulted from a clash between two powerful forces, the Soul Slayers against the Duskwalkers. So the Bladestorms are quite lethal, and some games could end up, could be cut short, quite literally. When a Bladestorm happens, there is a small percentage of chance that the Bladestorm will occur, and players need to escape from the battlefield as fast as possible. Otherwise, they are going to die. Any unit remaining in the battlefield when a Bladestorm happens dies automatically. So you have, as I was saying, a bit of information of the continent of Fallen, on how it was colonized, as they found these warlike and uncivilized people, and they were had to be defeated, and how they different civilizations move into the Western Bladelands, exploring everything that is unknown, because there's a high probability of finding artifacts and lost treasure, because this is a place of great storms, not only Bladestorms, normal storms as well. Sometimes cyclones and other natural and unnatural phenomena will kill entire armies, and those storms pick up different artifacts and weapons and armor and scatters them, just sprinkles them all over the place. So it's quite common to find some magical things throughout the entire, through different scenarios. The objectives of the scenarios are, there is variety to them, but a lot of them consist of recovering treasure. But you also have scenarios based on the victory condition consists on killing a particular monster or character, or maybe you just have to leave the surface, that is the battlefield, taking some treasure with you. Or maybe you need to secure a merchant wagon. So there is good variety. Although I did find that it has a very strong treasure hunter feel to it when it comes to the entirety of the campaign. There is variety, and you will not feel bored when playing all of the different scenarios. And you have information on Mercenary Forces, because Mercenary Forces, you're constantly going to be hiring them with the gold that you have obtained through different scenarios, and this will help mitigate some of the imbalances when it comes to larger forces. Because maybe you're not doing really very well, although there are ways to mitigate this. The game, the rules book gives you some information. For example, anyone who loses a scenario or battle still gets 200 points to spend in whatever he likes. And that's a great way to try to mitigate the snowballing effect that is, many of you know, when you are playing a campaign and you start winning and winning and winning and you become more and more powerful. Sometimes it's just impossible for the other player to catch up because your force has become so powerful. But you can mitigate this here using the experience points for the loser of the battles, or hiring mercenary forces. And this is a must in many cases, because even if you have a single, you were to have, let's say, 2 or 3 characters that are quite powerful, they could be easily killed if they get surrounded and they get attacked from behind or from the rear. That is actually somewhat difficult unless you attack with, let's say, 2 characters at the same time, because the character automatically gets the chance to turn around and face his opponent. But if you attack with 2, well, he won't be able to look into their directions at the same time. And you have information on the types of items and supplies that you can get through the entire campaign. And at the end of the book, you have an appendix detailing how to create your forces, summon animals and create undead, summon demons and elementals, more details concerning professions and skills. You also have a small bestiary. As I was saying, there is another book that is a proper bestiary, but here you have all the necessary things to play Bladestorm. You can even create your own monsters without having to purchase that bestiary. But if you want more monsters, you should consider getting that one. And if you want more information on the campaign setting, the first edition contains more information about that as well. You also have information on how to make conversions from Fantasy Hero or Rolemaster 2nd edition to this game. You also have game aids such as card templates, a standard rules summary sheet, and this is very cool, an optional rules summary sheet, because I love crunchy and detailed and deep games, so I'm always going to be using optional rules when playing this game. So what do I think of Bladestorm? This game is amazing, it's incredible, it's superb. I had a lot of fun playing it, and my opponent had a lot of fun too. Even with the introductory version of the game, it was quite exciting to see all the dice, sometimes dealing more damage than expected. And I just played a bit of the basic game, and I still feel quite excited that there is so much to explore. And when it comes to the professions, you could choose different professions and still customize them in different ways according to different skill trees. Each profession has 4 skill trees, so you can perhaps specialize in just 1 or 2 of those skill trees depending on the length of the campaign, and it will be great. I also think that it's excellent that you can play this as a skirmish type of game or role-playing game. And I forgot to mention that in the optional rules you have a way to handle a single model as if it were an entire unit, so you can play some mass battles using that system. So Bladestorm, I think the most enjoyable thing about Bladestorm when it comes to my experience with it is that I felt like I was rediscovering classic fantasy wargaming. It reminded me when I first got into fantasy in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and this felt so new to me and so exciting. And nowadays I think there is an abundance of high fantasy streamlined war games or skirmish games, but with Bladestorm it kind of takes you back to the classic fantasy side of things, but in a very polished and augmented way. I felt so excited as I was looking at these different pictures of miniatures, and as I was playing the game and handling all the crunchy bits. The system feels quite robust and effective, so I really like this game. I think I'm going to be playing it quite a bit for the rest of my life probably. And the scenarios are so great, you can play them several times with different armies and professions, and they're going to be quite fresh. And in my understanding, the first edition that is available as a PDF contains 20 more scenarios, if I'm not mistaken, so it's quite exciting and quite easy to build your own scenarios. And I can only imagine that this is going to be really fun if you play with, let's say, 6 or 8 players, although it probably takes an entire evening to do that, but it's so exciting. I also think that the value of this book is great. I've seen other fantasy games that have that enter a scenario and take treasure and try to get out of there with all the treasure that you took, but here with Bladestorm you don't only have that sense of being like a treasure scavenger, you also have different objectives and this neutral or non-player character type of enemies that attack you. This feels awesome. This is an excellent game, and I give my highest recommendation to Bladestorm 2nd edition. You need to purchase this game and play it right away. If you like role-playing games, you're going to enjoy it. If you like fantasy skirmish or war games, you have to play this one. And you have never played a role-playing game or a fantasy battles game, definitely get Bladestorm 2nd edition. Thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.